Thank you very much, Michael, for that generous introduction. And it's lovely to be here and to see you all. As a political journalist, I started reporting in Parliament House in 1988, and I think CEDA's been a part of my experience in federal politics, I think, for all that time. So I'm well used to the good work that CEDA does. Now, I did get this topic late in the day yesterday, but I have a rant that goes around in my head quite a lot these days, so it was quite easy to put it down on paper. I haven't had a chance to time this, so if I go for too long, please just chuck bread rolls or something at me. And this will, in paying heed to one of my former managers who used to, every time I raised a problem, come back with the question, what are you going to do to fix it? I'm going to propose a couple of potential solutions or things to think about in the current political environment. I do want to start, however, with some questions. When was the last time you heard a politician talking about doing something in the national interest and actually thought, yep, that's what they're doing? When was the last time you heard a political leader, a Prime Minister or opposition leader, or their senior colleagues talk without mentioning the opposite side in the first 2 or 3 sentences? And when was the last time you actually believed the political landscape was going to be stable for more than a year? If, like me, your answer to all 3 of those questions is, I can't actually remember when that happened, then welcome to politics 2017 style. It's been like this for a while. For those of us who've been waiting for politics to get back to normal, I think one of the sad things is this is the new normal. I have what has become a regular exchange with a person who is now a federal government minister who recently lamented to me that very few people in Parliament have experience of politics going back to the Howard years. That was the last time both of us considered that politics was normal. So what is the new normal that we have to look forward to? For one example, you only have to look at the start of the political year and the first parliamentary sittings for the year. Before it, the Prime Minister had to reshuffle his ministry because one of his ministers resigned. The first news poll showed a catastrophic vote for the coalition, I think of 35%, a primary vote, with no gain for the ALP and a big gain for Pauline Hanson. The politicians are eagerly awaiting the next news poll. For those politicians who say they don't pay attention to the polls, that is not true. We have elections coming up in WA and Queensland. People are keen to see what happens with One Nation in both of those. There's a lot of talk about One Nation preferences, but also politicians are looking to see whether One Nation takes away their primary vote as well. To top it all off, Cory Bernardi defected to a party so far of 1, and the government in a week had 3 different explanations of what its omnibus savings bill was for. It was originally to fund its childcare reforms, then it became a bill to fund the NDIS, and finally it just became a budget savings measure. There is also talk about tensions between the Treasurer and the Prime Minister and other government ministers, but that is gossip. The government, for all intents and purposes, is dealing with the agenda that Tony Abbott left it, particularly when it comes to budget cuts, and some things the government's walked away from, like higher education reform. It doesn't yet have a policy to replace it. And on this day, when the Fair Work Commission is handing down its penalty rates decision in about 6 minutes, it's worth remembering the government doesn't have an industrial relations policy either, more a catalogue of what it won't do, often written on large bits of paper handed to it by radio announcers. That is also a hangover of the Abbott government. In the process, it's putting together a budget in an anaemic economy. It's not bad, but it's not great. Employment rates that are not bad, but not great, and stagnant wages growth. It's trying to cut spending, but it's far from getting what it wants. It's up against an opposition that has learnt well from the way Tony Abbott treated it, and it's willing to respond in kind. It's not completely opposed to helping the government pass its legislation if it can get the concessions it wants, but it's not going out of its way to help. It has its own policy agenda, largely the agenda it took to the last election, and it's happy to be a little bit populist whenever it suits. And of course, nothing gets done without the numbers in the Senate. It's been that case for most of the last 30 years that I've been in politics. There was that brief golden moment in the Howard years, one term where it had a Senate majority, and arguably that didn't, in the end, help it all that much. The government's actually gone backwards in the Senate with the defection of Cory Bernardi. Before Cory Bernardi defected, the government had three options. It could look to the Labor Party to help it and negotiate with the Labor Party, which it did on one of its big budget savings bills. It could go to the Greens and ask the Greens to help, which it's done, or else it could go to what I call the pick and mix of crossbenchers, where it needs most of the crossbenchers on board. Not many people have realised, but with the defection of Cory Bernardi, I think the numbers have changed and it can no longer go to the Greens. I think it needs one other. Senate maths is very confusing, but I think it needs one other vote other than the Greens. So it'll have to be the Greens plus one or two of the pick and mix. What has changed in the Senate over my time in politics is the attitude of the crossbenchers and minor parties. They used to be there to improve government legislation. Now they have their own agenda and they want to implement it. They want to implement their policies and they won't do anything with government policies that conflict with their agenda. The government's dealing also with what the Labor Party has been dealing with really for 2 decades, and that is the splintering in the coalition's case of its right flank. Labor has been dealing with the Greens, the splintering of its left flank, for quite some time. Now there's more competition on the right flank of the Conservative Party. There has been before and it's gone away, but the competition now is greater and the coalition is dealing with it in a slightly different way to how it dealt, particularly with One Nation under John Howard. So, why are all these things happening? There are lots of reasons. I want to propose just a couple. One is that life does seem very uncertain at the moment. That's certainly the case on the geopolitical front. Australia's in an island, but that's only geography. In what Paul Keating used to call a outward-looking, internationally competitive economy, what happens in the rest of the world matters to us. There's uncertainty about what will happen in the United States under President Trump, how that will affect the global outlook, the global balance and the global economy. There was a lot of talk from commentators in the US, dealing particularly with the US media, that said the reason why the media underestimated Trump is that they took him literally but not seriously, and that Trump voters took him seriously but not literally. I imagine how those commentators must feel, knowing now that yes, you had to take Trump seriously, but you also had to take him literally because, unlike most politicians these days, he's actually doing what he said he would do, to the consternation of many who thought he might be different when he was president or might be able to be reined in. The courts have reined him in a little bit. We're waiting to see whether Congress reins him in anymore. So for countries like Australia, that poses challenges for us on the global front, on things like the fight against ISIS, but also on the economic front if he cuts corporate taxes, as he says he will, but also if his stance is actually more protectionist. There is no certainty about what it will look like and there is no certainty about what it will mean. China presents Australia with opportunities. If China keeps pump priming our economy and iron ore prices keep going up, that will make a very happy treasurer. But there are also threats, how China will respond to what might be a resurgent nationalism and protectionism in the US. Europe too is waiting to find out what Brexit means. There are potential opportunities for Australia, particularly on the trade front, but we don't know how they will play out. The continuing pace of technological change and disruptive industries bring uncertainty abroad and at home for those workers whose jobs are being lost by the forces of things like Uber and Airbnb and the economic shifts of Australia away from the mining boom and away from the wealth and the employment created by the mining boom. People are less wedded to political parties than they used to be, in part because the political parties are actually less wedded to themselves. The political leader, the Prime Minister, has now become a disposable economy. I've worked in the press gallery for nearly 30 years and it's telling that I've covered more Prime Ministers in the last 10 than I did in my first 20. In the old days, when things were normal, opinion polls triggered a leader to change policies or perhaps change the way they were sold. Now they're just a trigger to change the leader. If the Labor and the Liberal parties aren't going to take their own leaders seriously, why should the rest of the population? In this climate, the minor parties and independents are promising certainty. They're promising they can fix things. They actually can't, and some of their policies they propose aren't implementable. without serious adverse consequences, but to a voter who's worried about the major parties, that they're more interested in saving their own job than saving people's jobs, someone promising to look after the, and I'm going to do air quotes, average hard-working Australian begins to look like an attractive proposition. Another reason why things are uncertain, and another reason for the political climate we have, and this is the rant I often have to the minister I talk to regularly about how things are broken and need to be fixed, is that the policy reform process is broken, or rather politicians have forgotten how to do it. The idea that good policy makes good politics has given way to the idea that all politics, all the time, wins. It's a triumph of tactics over strategy. There are plenty of reasons for this, and yes, the media does play a very big part in that, but our political leaders don't seem to be able to hold on to an idea for more than a day or two. It takes even less time for the idea to come up, be put on the mythical table, than it is to be knocked off the table. In an environment where a proposal for states to share income taxing power lasts for about a day, in an environment where an idea for housing reform lasts from the time the newspapers come out till the finance minister knocks it off on a doorstop at 8 o'clock in the morning, in an environment where I think it was Glenn Stevens who said that voters vote for spending but not for how to pay for it, is there any wonder that nothing gets done? The notion that you can debate and discuss policy ideas, kick them around, get some reactions, see if they'll work, is dead in a world where politicians are so afraid of a backlash to any faintly controversial proposal that it gets killed off almost instantly. Worried about the backlash or keen to put a political stake in the heart of their opposition, the major parties also narrowed their own choices. Promising never to raise taxes means that a change in the tax mix is almost impossible. Making a AAA credit rating a sacred cow means budget policy might be driven by how ratings agencies on the other side of the world see it. There are lots of small ideas rather than a few big ones. When the Labor government, under, I can't remember whether it was Rudd or Gillard, was facing some trouble, which was really most of the time, I sat down with a minister who told me that one of their problems was that they had too many balls in the air at once. They actually needed to narrow what they were doing to 2 or 3 big ideas. We look at a point now where every day there's a shiny new ball in the air, and if we managed to look down, we'd see a whole lot of discarded balls, like one of those giant ball pits that kids play in. Government actually needs to get back to the old process, and I'm not saying this is easy, but it needs to get back to explaining the problem it wants to solve, proposing ideas to solve it, getting third-party support and making the case, not only to the Parliament, but to the people. And it needs to make the case over and over and over again. It's not easy in a world where the media gets bored pretty quickly, but it always has been and is now the only answer. I remember talking to a senior public servant a few years ago, probably not long after Abbott came in, and we were talking about the old days, and he was a public servant under Keating, and he said whenever Keating government would want to push something hard, they would clear the agenda for 3 months of other stuff. Now, there's always unexpected stuff that comes up, but of everything else, they'd clear the agenda and that's what they'd talk about. And it used to be an old maxim that when we in the press gallery are so sick of an idea or a phrase or a topic that our ears were bleeding, that's when the public only just gets it. Governments do need to deal with the uncertainties in life. They need to be clear about what they can and they can't do. They have less control over the economy now than they used to in the days when Paul Keating used to be able to pull economic levers. Yet budget forecasts are treated as holy writ when they're wrong nearly every year because they are forecasts. They are not reality. Governments can't fix everything, but they often talk like they can. They will fail to fix everything and they sometimes discourage some self-reliance. That old thing my manager used to tell me. Kick it back to people. Yes, you've got a problem. What are you doing to fix it? They need to give people some confidence that they can. There are things they can actually fix themselves and that gives people back some power. Outside groups, lobby groups, peak bodies can also encourage change and help explain it. And be prepared to offer something in return. They often go to governments demanding things, but I very rarely see groups, be they on the left or the right, say we would like you to do this and we're prepared to give up this to help it happen. They can help government keep a conversation going quite sometimes for a long time by being part of it rather than looking on and then expressing disappointment when it all doesn't go terribly well. There are bright signs in my rather gloomy view of things. One of those is that sometimes big reforms in Australia take a really, really long time. The GST took a good 20 years. Sydney's second airport is just being built after what is 30 years of talking about it, so maybe I just have to hang around a bit longer. Finally, I'll leave you with this. The two happiest politicians I've seen in recent days have been the Prime Minister, who was in an incredibly good mood when he came into our office last Thursday for an interview. The other one is Nick Xenophon, who is always having fun. I don't quite know what they means, and I expect they're happy for very different reasons, but it will be fun to find out over the next few months why that is the case. Thank you.
Lyndal, thank you for covering such an enormous amount of ground. I thought I might just start the discussion off by focusing you in on the politics of budget reform. We've got a government at the moment that is proposing, on the one hand, a company tax cut, and on the other hand, reining in a series of, let's call it, welfare measures. Is the politics of this completely broken? It seems to me to be giving Bill Shorten a free kick every time the government tries to do something different with this omnibus savings bill. And does it have to rethink that, or can it make this budget repair package work?
I think it may get something through in its budget repair package. I don't think it'll be exactly what it wants. All the talk's been that Nick Xenophon and his party have ruled it out, and Pauline Hanson and her party have ruled it out for various reasons, but that shouldn't be mistaken for the end of the matter. That's just the ambit claim for the opening of negotiations. So it's possible it will get something through. The company tax cut, I think, will end up that they will legislate the small and medium tax cuts, and then maybe they'll have to go quiet on the tax cuts for bigger business, which were always at the back end of the process. It is a hard sell, though, and I think they will do more on welfare reform. They've been looking very closely at the New Zealand model for a while. It's always a hard ask when you're giving something to companies, yet taking money off poorest Australians. And I don't think it particularly sells the case for company tax cuts well, the link between tax cuts and driving growth in the economy. They don't, there are no graphs and charts hanging out there that come from the Treasurer to say, this is what happens, this is what will happen, this will mean you get jobs, this is the likely employment pickup. Yes, you may be on welfare, but actually if companies can employ more people, you've got a better chance of getting a job, which is what you want. And that comes back to the case that they don't argue their case very well. I don't know what problem they're trying to solve, apart from they'd like to make the economy better, but there's no detail about that. And there's little bits now of if Trump cuts taxes, then we will be left at the upper end of the company tax cut. But they're not out arguing it day in, day out and convincing people. So it will be a hard ask. There are signs that they're giving ground on things like the Medicare rebate benefits to doctors. So the government always starts out big and then, because of a backlash, gets reined in, which is kind of the way it always used to be, but I don't think it's working particularly well at the moment.
Over to you, ladies and gentlemen, please.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating, and I think you probably articulated a lot of things that a lot of people are thinking. So I'm Simonetta Astolfi from Maddox, sorry. One of the reasons that is sometimes given for the new normal in politics is the 24-hour media cycle and the rise of social media. And I'd just be interested in your comment on that and whether there's any difference in the responsibility and the role of the media in the current political environment from what it used to be.
That's a big question that I've been grappling with for a very long time. I actually think the biggest change in the media and its effect on politics was the decision by newspapers that they would no longer just do yesterday's news. They want something new on the front page every morning because they need to sell newspapers, because they're not selling them as much as they did last year. So if you look at any newspaper, you'll see a splash of red ink all over it saying exclusive. Sometimes for things that aren't particularly exclusive, but that's all right. It's exclusive to the newspaper that day, even though other people might have reported it before. And I've often thought if governments actually wanted to do something for the media industry, the first thing they could do is subsidise red ink. So that's changed because governments are under pressure to come up with something new every day for the newspapers, because the newspapers are under pressure to sell newspapers. Social media helps and hinders. It, like stations that I've worked for, News 24 and now Sky, actually give politicians a better chance than they have ever had to talk directly to the people. And politicians who use it well, John Key used to use it really well, do get to talk directly to people. They have opportunities now to have speeches shown live that they never had. They have opportunities now to do lengthy interviews and explain things that they never had. But they also have more opportunity to get themselves into trouble by saying things in interviews with the person I replaced David Spears for which they were not prepared, and consequently winning him Walkley Awards because he's very, very good at it. So it helps and hinders. I think the media's role is not to help a government carry a conversation, but I've told government ministers when they say, you know, we can't argue a policy case for a very long time because you get bored. I say there are hundreds of people I can talk to about any issue. I can talk to policy experts, I can talk to people who are affected by it, I can talk to people overseas who've been dealing with it. I can fill the airwaves. That's not hard. Give me a meaty policy issue that's interesting, that affects people, and not a lot of what we talk about in Parliament House at the moment actually affects people. People will be interested. I can slice and dice an issue 50 ways before breakfast. But it would be hard for them to do it. I'm not saying going back to the old way of doing policy reform isn't easy. They will get kicked by newspapers, but also we're the media. We tend to get bored pretty quickly and we'll move on and kick someone else.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for that incredibly depressing assessment.
I often say what's fun for journalists is not always so good for the country.
Yeah, I'm in a university, that's okay, it's part of our business, trying to understand it all. So Jane O'Dwyer from the ANU. A question for you about whether or not we need to go back to the old ways or actually need to find new ways. So there's potential, given the current external environment that we're operating in, our own economic environment, that we end up in a crisis point sometime in the near future or the relatively near future. And that can create the conditions that enable governments to actually undertake major reform and perhaps address some of the partisanship in our political system. But there's a question that comes out from your discussion, which is, does government, both at a political level and a bureaucratic level, have the capacity to drive major reform anymore, or has it become a kind of program deliverer moving through very quickly? And so does that mean actually we might want to look at new ways of running the conversation and the ideas for policy reform, which means, I guess, new opportunities for places like universities and think tanks to actually participate and perhaps steer some of that conversation?
I think there have always been opportunities for third parties to drive conversations or to at least start conversations. I have a couple of examples. My most recent one is the question of superannuation, which I think Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute started whinging about talking about a few years ago, and talking loudly and often about problems in the superannuation industry at a time when superannuation was a sacred cow and no one would touch it. To go from that to now, when the government's implemented superannuation reform, not exactly what he wanted, but it's no longer untouchable. It's an area that people debate not whether they should touch it, but how to change it to make it work better. So it's possible to have those conversations started by other people. And I think a crisis does help because that explains the problem. That does the government's work of saying this is a problem we need to deal with, because the problem's very clear to people. It's, you know, if it's a big crisis, if it's a global financial crisis, it's in the newspapers every day. You don't need to do that heavy lifting to explain why you need to do something. And at that stage, we had smart people in the public service and smart people in our financial institutions who gave the government advice, and things happened. The coalition government would say too much happened, but things happened which kept us out of a recession. But the problem didn't need to be explained because it was there and people knew it. So I think it's easier to do something in a crisis. But also I think there is still, I think, broad agreement between the Labor and the Liberal Party about what an Australian economy should look like. But that kind of compact is fraying at the edges, and both sides see political advantage in taking an opposing view. They don't see a political advantage in helping each other. In a crisis, that might change, I don't know. You look at the issue of national security, though, and both parties are almost always, you would know this, Michael, in lockstep. that there's very rarely the government proposes something on the national security front where the opposition sticks its hand up. There is some questioning and some changes that happen at the committee level in Parliament with a very good committee that looks at legislation. And I think in that case sometimes it's almost a problem that the decisions we make about the balance between our rights and keeping us safe, you know, I actually think we should talk about that more. But I don't know how you get back to the kind of Hawke-Keating-Howard days where oppositions were willing to at least look at parts of serious policy reform and engage in them.
Other issues?
Anything, feel free to beat up on the media.
Over on the left, thanks.
Hi, thanks, Lyndal. Sam Engel from the ACT Chief Minister's Directorate. Just be interested to hear your assessment of the role of the state and territory governments in the policy reform, given the sort of logjam at the national level.
Premier's Conference, or now COAG, which is the world's ugliest acronym, are actually some of my favourite things because you get interesting political alliances. I remember when Paul Keating and Jeff Kennett used to team up against the other premiers, and the same thing I think happened occasionally with John Howard and Bob Carr. I think the states have a huge role to play for lots of different reasons. One is that the states have, and we all know, budgetary problems that they're looking for the Commonwealth to solve. But I think the conversation has never gotten to a point where they've actually all agreed on the way to solve them without actually running their own agenda. And in some cases, it's a problem of competing mandates or competing things that they want to do. Sometimes you will have seen in the past the federal government tip more money into an area only for states to take their own money out. Federal governments always complain about states cost shifting money from the states to the Commonwealth, and states always complain about the Commonwealth tying their hands too hard in what they want to do. I think good work gets done through COAG, often on things that aren't very interesting or sexy, but things like red tape reduction, harmonising regulations, all those things are really good and help. Nobody bothers to explain them to people because they assume they'll be boring, and that's the media's fault too. But those things help, those things make things better. They mean if you're a parent, say in a Defence Force family who's regularly changing schools and systems in states, that your life becomes easier. Those things actually have real world consequences, so they could talk about that stuff. I'm a Canberra girl. I'm one of the few still in captivity. And whenever anyone asks me about the states, I always say we should abolish them because nobody cares about Canberra. So, but I actually think the system of I think actually the federation works really well, and it does enable kind of competing ideas to be discussed at a state and federal level, and does allow, if people knew about it, a clear division of responsibilities. But it's not always the case that the states are able to do exactly what they should say they do because they're stretched for funds, and the Commonwealth has the power, more power to raise money than states do, and particularly in a place like the ACT where the tax base isn't very broad and depends a lot on taxing people. I don't have an answer to that one, but I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have. But it's worthwhile, any politician who gets to a leadership position is a serious politician and is smart and is capable of carrying an argument. And if you could harness the ability of all the leaders to do that, then the conversation might improve.
So speaking of interesting political alignments, something interesting going on in the West at the moment. We've got the Liberals preferencing One Nation and talk of the Nationals preferencing the Greens. Is this a harbinger of kind of throwing the whole sandbox up nationally, or is the West just being weird as usual?
Politicians in the end have to go for their jobs every 3 or 4 years. And when an election comes around, that focuses a politician's mind on how they're going to keep the job. And that's why I think you see preference deals that in John Howard's day wouldn't be countenanced. because obviously it means the Liberal Party's worried that it's going to lose and it's looking for ways to win. Politicians often get chipped for looking for ways to win, but it's how they keep their jobs, so we'll cut them a bit of slack on that. I think it will depend whether the One Nation threat actually is what they say it is. If you look at the Greens often poll better than they do at elections. One Nation polled very well and did very well in Queensland for a very brief period and then splintered. Speaking to some people in the West, they don't necessarily think the Rod Cullerton thing helped Pauline Hanson. So I think it will depend how it goes, that if there is advantage for the Liberal Party in preferencing One Nation, then the Queenslanders might look to that model. But you also got to look at what happens to One Nation over a longer period of time, whether they can actually still deliver things in federal parliament, or whether they splinter a bit more than they do. And the Nationals in Western Australia are in a room of their own.
I hope I didn't offend anyone in the West, but I'm from Queensland, so I can do that. Yes, please.
My question really comes back, you focused on stability of Howard and Keating against the chaos of today. But we're now talking, I've heard reference to there's talks of going for a 4-year fixed parliament instead of our floating 3 years as it goes. In your opinion, is that going to help the chaos or is it going to take us back to stability?
I think 4-year fixed terms have been picked up in most of Australia, and I think there has to be a reason for that. 3 years is a very short period of time. 3 years gives you the first year figuring out what you're going to do, the second year actually doing it, and the third year selling it and run for an election. So your budgetary cycle then becomes looking for money to do something, doing something, and then finding enough money to spend in an election, doing stuff you wouldn't necessarily do but you need to because you need to get elected. So I think adding an extra year would bring governments some breathing room that they need to think about how they're going to do things and then actually deliver them. Because not a lot of government these days is not a lot of talk about politics, focuses on delivery. We always pay a lot of attention to the announcement and the delivery kind of sometimes doesn't happen very well after that. So I don't think it's a bad proposition and it's been kicking around for a long time. So maybe like the GST in Sydney's second airport, they might actually pick it up and see the benefit in it. The downside of 4-year terms, fixed 4-year terms, as was shown by the constant change in New South Wales, is that when a government's bad, it takes a year more to get rid of them. But it's not a long time. And when I was talking about stability of Hawke, Howard and Keating, it was relative stability, relative to what we have now.
Well, Lyndal, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not sure what your conclusions are, but my conclusions from Lyndal's session are that we may be worried and a bit depressed about the people we've got in Parliament House, but certainly the journalists are of the very highest quality. So could you join me in thanking Lyndal Curtis?